Hello everyone, this is your absolute beginner's guide to chess. We will go through the rules, how to set up the board, and how you go in your first game. The pawn moves one square forward at a time, unless it's its first move. Then it can choose to either move one or two squares forward. The pawn can only move forward if it's not blocked by another piece. So if there would be a pawn in the way, it cannot move forward. The way this pawn captures other pieces is one square diagonally, like this. So if there would be a black pawn, let's say here, we could move two squares forward, and if black would choose to move its pawn up one square, we can then capture the pawn diagonally. Remember that we cannot capture a pawn like this, or any other piece. We can only capture one square diagonally. The most important point about the pawn is that it once it reaches the last rank, it can promote to any piece except the king. So in most cases you would go down the board and then promote to a queen. The rook can move any amount of squares forwards, backwards or sideways if there is space. This means that if there would be a piece in the way, it cannot move through the piece or jump over it. However, it can capture the piece if it's in the path. The bishop moves any amount of squares diagonally in any direction. It cannot jump over any other pieces, but what it could do is capture a piece that's in the path. So if there would be, we can say, a black knight here, it cannot jump over the black knight, but it would be able to capture this piece on the board. The queen is the most powerful piece on the chessboard. This is because it can move like a rook and a bishop together. So it can move forwards, backwards, sideways, and diagonally unlimited amount of squares. Like any other piece, it cannot jump over pieces, but it can capture a piece that's in the path of the queen. So, if there would be a black pawn here on b7, it would be able to capture the, the pawn, but it cannot jump over the pawn. The king can move one square at a time in any direction. So it can move one square forward, one square sideways, one square backwards, or one square diagonally in any direction. It can also then capture a piece that is undefended in this area. No pieces on the chessboard can jump over others, except the knight. The knight is very tricky in this sense because it has a very unique path when it moves. So it moves two square forwards and one square sideways. So we would be able to move it like this. It can move in any direction like this. So it moves like an L, you could say, in any direction. And it can therefore jump out of very tight spaces. So if we would put a lot of rooks around the knight like this, it can jump away, jump out. If you're playing over the board on a real chessboard with real chess pieces, you have to be aware of how to set up the board correctly. There should be a dark square in your down left corner and a dark square in your up right corner. The next thing is how to set up the pieces. So you set it up with pawns on the second rank of one color and pawns of the other color, in this case black, on the other second rank, or on the seventh rank, you could also see it as. Then you're supposed to set up the rest of the pieces, the rook, knight, bishop, king, and queen. You set it up as follows: rook in the corners, then knights, then bishops, and then you have to think a little bit when it comes to setting up the king and queen. So the white queen should stand on a white square. there should be the same color queen as the square behind it. So if we look on the other side of the board, there should be a black queen on the dark square, like this. Then the king stands on the square next to that piece, on the same thing on the other side. And then you just fill it out. So rooks in the corners, then the knights, then bishops. And of course, don't forget the pawns then. Now I will show you a very important rule in chess. It's called castling. So I'll just show you a couple of quick moves here. So in this position, white can choose to castle his king. Castling means that you move your king 2 squares to the side, and the rook that's in the corner will then jump over the king next to it. It looks like this. So as you see, we went from having the king here and the rook in the corner to the rook switching place with the king, and the king moves 2 squares. There are a couple of conditions for this to be possible. First of all, the king and the rook that you're castling with cannot have moved during the game. So if the rook has moved, you cannot castle with that rook anymore. A second point is that there cannot be any pieces in the way. So in this position, white cannot castle because the bishop is in the way. So we move the bishop out of the way in order to be able to castle. The next point is that there cannot be any opponent's pieces in the way. So if we would have had this black bishop, let's say here, you cannot castle. You could have captured it, but you cannot. You could have captured with, let's say, the knight or the rook, but you cannot castle through the bishop. And the last point is that if any square is controlled by your opponent's pieces, where the king will go. I will show a different example here. If we just take a very strange position, let's do this. So if we have, this is a very unique position, but here the black bishop is controlling the king's path into castling long. So you can castle long and castle short. In this position you cannot castle long because the black bishop is in the way. So if we, let's say, play this move, blockading the bishop moves back, now we can castle long. And once again, the rook goes, the king moves 2 squares to the side that you're castling, the king ends up next to the king. The rook ends up next to the king. And we could also castle short. Also in this position, we could have castled short instead of playing this pawn move. Now let's go through another important rule of chess. It's called a check. I'll just make some moves here on the board. So in this position, white can play this bishop b5. Check it's called. You see, if white would be able to make another move, we could theoretically go ahead and take the king. When you're playing chess, you can never capture the king, but you could see it as if you would have made another move, you can take the king. That is what a check is. There are 3 ways to go out of the check, we could say. In this position, black can only really block the check. So, for example, we could go bishop to d7, blocking the path. The bishop cannot take the king now. It could possibly take the bishop. There are a couple other ways to do this, to get out of the check for black. So I will make 2 new random moves. Here white once again can make the check, but we have the black has the option of, instead of blocking with a piece, he could walk out of the check, and there is no piece controlling this square anymore. The last thing you could do when it comes to checks is you could capture the piece. So if black would be to play this pawn move here, it is now controlling this square, and white plays this check. Black could now either block the check with some piece, or he could simply capture the bishop. The bishop does not check the king anymore. If the king would end up in a position where it cannot get out of the check, like cannot move out of the check, cannot capture the checking piece, or cannot block the check, this is called checkmate. Once a king is checkmated, the the checkmating side wins. So in this case, white wins because black's king cannot walk out of the check because it's controlled by the queen. And, and like you see it, the white king is controlling all these squares, and the black king cannot capture the queen since the white king is defending the queen. I will give you a quick example of a checkmate, and I will just show you something called the scholar's mate. So it looks like this. Uh, so in this position, white is threatening checkmate, and uh, with queen by capturing this pawn with the queen, since it's defended. So a common mistake is playing this move, uh, where thinking that white is not threatening anything, and then white just takes. And as you see this logo, it means there is checkmate. The black king cannot walk out of the check, cannot capture the queen since it's defended. And so this would be checkmate. The last rule of chess that I need to point out is a rule that very few beginners know of, but it can come handy at some point. So let's say in this position that black would be to move, and he thinks that, oh, I can walk past the white pawn like this, and if this special rule would not exist, white would not be able to stop the black pawn from just walking down. However, there is a special rule called en passant, and this means in a passing in French. And that's exactly what it is. So when the black pawn moves 2 squares forward like this, you can actually capture it and it will be removed from the board. So how did it look? Well, it looks like this. So if black would be to play a move two moves, so it lands adjacent to your pawn, you can actually take the pawn and it will be removed from the board. I will show a concrete example of this in position. So if we would see this position on the board and black decides to play his pawn like this, white actually has the choice to capture the pawn, and then black would probably capture, but that's not the important point. So once, if your opponent makes a pawn move and it's 2 squares, it has to be 2 squares. So if let's say we do this and we go here, and black then decides to go like 1 square like this, you cannot take it anymore. And also if he moves his pawn 2 squares now, you see they are not landing next to each other, they are landed diagonal from each other, so white cannot take this pawn. So if the white pawn is on the 5th rank or the black pawn on the 4th rank, you can actually take en passant. I'll show another example of this if black decides to essentially do the same thing and white plays c4. The pawn moves up 2 squares and lands next to the black pawn. Black can now choose to take this white pawn with this special rule. I hope you have enjoyed this chess guide. I highly encourage you to go onto chess.com. I will leave a link down in the description and play your first game. It's completely free and I'm not sponsored, but I really like this site. So I will leave a link down in the description. So go down and click on it, play your first game. Doesn't take too much time and it's a lot of fun to get into it. Also, please leave a like and subscribe, and don't forget to ask any questions down in the comments. Bye!